Could you describe the editing facilities at Wilbur and the whole process there and how involved you were with it?
Yeah, I was 100% involved with it when we were doing stock film, and that's what we were doing most of at the beginning. And we were cutting 35 on upright moviolas. We were making print, often from original negative or master, mostly out of the Grinberg Library, which at that time was the original Pathé News and the Paramount News Library. And it's horrible to speak of it. It's almost like a war crime. But to make things faster, we had a puller, a fellow who would go over and get from Grinberg the original rolls that we needed for the show, bring them over in film cans, and we would look at them on bullseye viewers on just on the editing bench.
Just, a bullseye viewer, is that, can you describe that?
Well, it's just a very primitive, tiny little device. It looks like the first motion picture camera. I mean, it's so elemental and silly. And it's just a revolving drum of shutter of some sort, and then a big lens held right in front of it. If you look at it at just the right angle, you can see the image as you wind away, dragging the film through the gate. I think we should. You think, Kim? Do you hear it? Be quiet. So I say it was like a work crime because we were not professional film handlers. This wasn't print. Sometimes it was camera original, and we were looking at it in a big hurry, and obviously scratching it, obviously getting it dirty, obviously breaking off the leader, not putting the backlight one. Even at the time, I knew it was a terrible thing to do, but it was expedient, and we couldn't afford to make print. So we only printed what we wanted, and the only way to determine what we wanted was to look at the original film.
Now, how did you get access to this footage, and if you used stills from other sources, how did that happen that you had that kind of access?
Well, Walper had a deal with Sherman Grinberg, who had gotten from Columbia the rights to the Pathé Library, and then later from Paramount the rights to Paramount. And it was at a time when the studios were in big financial trouble, and their newsreel libraries were just a total liability. And they started finding people like Sherman who would come in and start selling the stuff to outsiders. And unfortunately, the income was enough to take care of people like Sherman who ran it as a business, but it was not enough to maintain the libraries. So the libraries, over a period of time, this is another story, but starting right about the time I'm talking about, late 50s, early 60s, the library started getting raided, and it's still going on, and they've suffered terribly at the hands of TV.
Wow. Well, in looking at all this stuff, what did you feel were the most important elements in accurately depicting a person's life story?
Well, the the most important element was time, of which we didn't have very much. But, I was well aware at the time that I was reading, one for a biography, maybe one book, where there were 20, or probably 5, that if I had time, I would have read. And that there was lots of film that we didn't have time to find that would have told the story better. That's what we needed, and that's what we didn't have. We did the best we could under the circumstances.
So in choosing among the books or the sources, was that your decision? Would you just...
Yeah. Whatever fell readily to hand. Frankly, what looked like an easy read, and had pictures. Well, pictures in part to tell you ahead of time what you'd be looking for in the newsreels with public figures.
And then did you use stills as well?
Yes, we did. We did a lot of stills. I mean, we did people whose early lives, that was all there was.
Now, who else worked on the biography series? I have Al Ram?
Al Ramers was a major producer, Billy Edgar. Gary read me some names the other day, which would help me now.
Forrest Allen, Erwin
Yeah.
Roston?
Erwin Roston, Forrest Allen.
And who were these people?
Producers who, Erwin, of course, who later had a lot to do with my career, had come from KNX. He was a full-fledged newsman, a real pro compared to the rest of us. Forrest Allen was a mystery man from San Francisco who made, and someone reminded me, Mark Twain. He made a great biography on Mark Twain. And he did it all up in San Francisco from stills, shot his own material, wrote his own material. It's very good. And the big thing about Forrest, we have no idea what happened to him. He simply vanished. And the mail kept coming for him, and bill collectors and all sorts of stuff for a year or two after he was gone. And we never knew what happened to him. And up until, it may have been a decade ago, that still when the Writers Guild published their uncollected residuals list, Forrest was on it. Love to know.
Interesting.
Mm.
Now, this is when you first started working with Erwin Roston. What was it that, did something happen during this work process that would, make it possible for you to go on and work together in the future at, I think, Roanoke's?
Right.
And I don't know when that was.
Well, roughly, I think it was in the second year of biography. Erwin went to work for Walper doing the same thing I was. We became friends. We went on to work on a series called Men in Crisis, which was a spin-off of the biography series, and do some specials. And we were both, what we wanted was the network shows. Oh, and we both worked on Hollywood and the Stars. I forgot that network series. But we wanted the network. We wanted better work and more money and all of that. So we got to a certain point, and Erwin had friends at MGM. We went over and had one interview there, and he said, "Well, you're doing wonderful stuff, and you guys are the wave of the future, and why don't you come over and do the same thing you're doing now for us?" And we said, "Fine, make us an offer," and they did, and next thing we knew, the documentary department of MGM Studios, which was in those days a real contradiction in terms. I mean, MGM and documentary were just two sides, different sides of town.
Well, what was the notion that they had?
The notion was pretty much what happened, that we would compete with Geographic, which by now was up and running, and that we would exploit the film library to some degree, which we did, making a couple of shows.
Let me get back to biography for a little
right.
bit, because there are a couple of things. What was your biggest challenge in producing the shows for biography?
Well, the hard part was we had to write scripts in front, in part because of Mike Wallace's availability. I mean, he would do it when he would do it, and that was not necessarily when we were ready for him. And also, I mean, as everyone finds out, the quickest way to make a presentable film is to write the script and cut pictures to fit it. The hard part was, of course, not having prints of the film available, and usually looking at it in negative upside down on this silly little viewer, ordering the print, and then in the interim writing the script. It was all happening before the fact. So you had to write, the scripts were exceedingly general, because you were trying to write lines to fit however it was going to work out, You'd set up a scene. You knew you had the scene, but you certainly weren't going to say, at the top of the church tower, so-and-so was doing such and such, because God knows whether the shot of the church tower was any good, or the church tower you saw in the negative was the church tower that really played a part, So you had to write very loose, general, rather open-ended narration that would work with anything. And that was good training, especially when you discovered in the editing room how many different pictures would work with those words, and how different the messages could be delivered with the same, assembly kit.
Now, if you had how would you prefer to work, or how do you work? Well,
We'll get to that.
We'll get to that.
But
I'm jumping ahead.
As soon as we could, and even at Walper, we started turning things around. We started cutting picture and then writing. And that was, obviously a far superior way to work, and the way I've tried to work ever since.
What were some of the other biography shows you worked on?
Well, Gary read off a list. It was amazing.
Thomas Edison?
Thomas Edison was one of the early one. Amelia Earhart. I think two half hours on Churchill. Will Rogers. I need a list.
Well, which one seemed special to you? Was the Thomas Edison a special
Edison
one?
was great. That was won an award at the San Francisco Film Festival, and was really quite a big deal, and was well reviewed. He turned out to be a great subject, and at that time I remember getting the assignment, and nobody thought it was very exciting because Thomas Edison was, school book stuff. But to actually see him and hear him and realize what it was to do what he had done, and what an interesting, obscure, the phenomena of genius was really interesting. It came off, I think, pretty well. And the first time I thought, well, I really got a piece of that one.
Now, when did the Wolper series end, and why? The biography, Wolper biography series.
We ran out of film, I think. In 2 years, we had done, well, let's say 2 times 26, maybe more than that. And we were pretty much at the end of the most opportune biographies that could be made out of the newsreel film we had. Also, David, I think, was through with that particular deal. We were getting $25,000 a show to begin with. I think it got up maybe to 50 by the end of the second season, but David wanted to break out of that.
Now, do you ever watch the A&E version of biography?
Sometimes, yeah.
What do you think?
Well, it's so different, yet in some ways so much the same. One thing, just the range of characters they do is so much wider. We did not do, probably because we didn't have access, we didn't do current show business people. We didn't do anybody who wasn't, already in the History Museum. So it's amazing the variety of people they're doing. But they call from time to time and ask where I got this piece of film or that piece of film, and it's kind of fun.
Then after that, was there the series Hollywood in the Stars, and whose series was that? Was
Haley,
that Wolper?
Haley again. I mean, Haley producing the series for NBC, and just what it sounded like. And again, we only did one season because we ran out of film. We had a deal with one, perhaps two studios. Our big resource was Warner's UA, which gave us United Artists and all the older Warner Brothers pictures, which, pretty much dictated the shows we made. Gangsters, I think we made 2 parts. It was great. Warner's did all the classic old gangster, Bogart, Cagney stuff, But in other areas, we had almost nothing. We'd use stills or whatever we could get hold of. I remember I did the sex symbols show, and it was pathetic. I think we had stills of Marilyn Monroe, I think nothing of Rita Hayworth, a little bit of Betty Grable, but it just wasn't where the resource was good.
Now, who sponsored the series?
I don't know. It was NBC. It was full network, so they rounded up the people.
Now, how was it working with Jack Haley Jr. on this series?
Well, after 2 years of biography, I think we got used to each other. It was fine, and of course Jack knew everything. Research really wasn't necessary. He'd tell you what you needed to put in the script. And he had great background. He loved the material. He was really good with it.
Now, were there other studios that had the Marilyn Monroe footage? Were they unwilling to? Well, tell me about that.
Well, it just television and movies were still to a great degree antagonists, and movies at first were not going to allow any movie to be shown on television. And I think Fox, MGM, certainly Fox, MGM, and probably Columbia, Warner Brothers, were holdouts for a long, long time and didn't sell their films intact to TV. So they certainly weren't going to let people like us for very small money to pull scenes. It just wasn't on. There wasn't enough money to pay for it.
So, so what would you say the critical reaction to the series was?
I think it was pretty good. Certainly people like to watch it. It's very nostalgic.
And what about the Hollywood community? What was their perspective?
What I knew about was approving. I mean, you would run into antagonism from time to time. Later, say I did a show for MGM about Clark Gable, and I ran into the real hardcore at MGM and elsewhere. Bitterness about TV. Worked all sorts of different ways. MGM, we had to fight to get a piece from Gone with the Wind into the Clark Gable biography that we were producing for MGM. It was still, the holiest of holy, a film that would never be shown on television. And I had to go to New York and make a presentation to the old guard and say, and won the day eventually because they were so sentimental about Clark and so forth. And, how can you do this to Clark, not have his finest role? And they went for that.
So would you say that this was a groundbreaking series in the terms of, looking at Hollywood filmmaking by a documentary?
Yeah, I think so. A series.
Uh-huh.
There had been specials before, and Jack Haley made 3 great specials for Walper before the series that were Hollywood and the Stars and Hollywood the Great, Hollywood the Golden Years was the first. Hollywood the Fabulous Era was the second. I forget what the third was, but that was very groundbreaking. And with a special, and if you worked all the angles and you could, indulge yourself in a lot of politics just to get one clip, you could get much better coverage. And you could exploit the studio's promotional stuff, and often if you would put in a clip of one of their new movies that was just coming into release, they'd ease up on some of the older stuff.
But you really had to go and beg for the Clark Gable.
I had to beg for the Clark Gable, but after Gable left MGM, I had a terrible time with Fox, with United Artists, getting anything from them, and getting anything from even the family and friends of Clark's. I ran into this bitterness about MGM because they hadn't been fair to Clark in the end, and about television, and Clark shouldn't be on television. He's a movie star.
Now, what was the show, What a Way to Go, an extravaganza in the making?
Well, that was a funny one. It was when we were running out of film, and we got sort of a trading relationship with some studios, and this was Fox. And it was a Shirley MacLaine movie on which they'd shot a lot of behind the scenes. And Arthur Jacobs, who was the producer, was an ex-publicist, and he had a keen sense of promotion. So he offered his cooperation, and we made the film about the making of that movie. And that was about it. The funny part is that what interested me more was this movie that Arthur was making because he bought a book which he had not read because it was by the author of The Bridge on the River Kwai. And he discovered, after he bought it, that it was a movie about a planet where the apes were in charge and the human beings were in cages. And this worried him terribly. And he was making that at the same time he was making What a Way to Go. And What a Way to Go was going to make him a lot of money. And this ape movie, he really, he would call me and he said, what am I going to do? All these guys in ape suits. And, So, of course, What a Way to Go bombed, and Planet of the Apes went on.
Did you work on Planet of the Apes?
No, but I wanted to do the behind the scenes on Planet of the Apes. I thought it'd be more interesting, but Arthur didn't want to waste time on an obvious loser.
Now, who was the director of What a Way to Go?
I cannot remember. He was an Englishman.
J. Lee Thompson?
J. Lee Thompson, yeah.
And what was your relationship with him since you were poking around there?
I just did an interview with him. He's very pleasant. He was a thorough old professional, but he was fine. And that's right. And I did a show called The Great Directors later. I think after that, because I found that the director really loved sitting down and talking about their movies, and they would help us get the clips. So we were off.
Now, was it unusual at that time to discuss the work of directors? I mean, was
just coming in, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, Wells, yes, but lesser lights weren't getting much attention until maybe early '60s.
So, what year was The Great Directors?
Oh, that was one of the Hollywood and the Stars.
And which directors did you do?
Oh gosh. Well, some I had no access to. We certainly did Hitchcock. We certainly did Wells. I'm trying to remember the people I did have. John Sturgis, for one. He was great. Wonderful interview. Very helpful. Stanley Kubrick. Memory fails me beyond that.
Now, how did these shows do in the ratings?
I think it did well. It wasn't a breakout success. I remember David was very, very sorry that we couldn't do another season. And we could have done another season if we'd had access to the material.
Now, who was it? Was it Joseph Cotton was the narrator on this?
Right.
And how was it to work with him?
Great. He was, well, there's a story. We hired him without testing him because he was very big and his agent, was not going to do anything. Just give us the money and you'll get Mr. Cotton. So we got him into the first recording session, and there was this clickety-click, click, click. And it was our studio. We just built a little booth in the basement. So we thought it must be us, and we asked him to excuse us and fussed around with the equipment. Eventually we realized it was coming out of his mouth. It was his false teeth clacking. And it was impossible to cut around. It was even in the words, because it was worst when he was actually making the sounds. So we paused for negotiation. The agent said, that's your problem. You bought Mr. Cotton the way he is. If you want him to have new teeth, you're going to have to pay for him. So Cotton had to go out and get a new set of dentures, which were fantastically expensive. And Walper moaned and groaned about the expense. And, it was a good 2 or 3 weeks before these new teeth were fitted. But sure enough, they didn't make any noise. After that, it was straight. It was great. It was no problem. He was terrific. He's a very good narrator.
Was he happy to get his new choppers?
Yeah, he joked about it. I think, they looked just about like the old ones, but I guess they fit a lot better.
They sounded better.
Yeah.
But was he aware before this that this would come up in a recording?
I don't think so. I don't think he'd done much voiceover.
Great story. Now, what about the Men in Crisis series? Can you tell me what that was?
Well, that was the
about?
one that, it was a sequel to Biography, and it was supposed to be the one we'd make a lot of money on because we got more money than we did for Biography. And basically, we were taking Biography and remixing the elements, and it was a story of antagonists, Men in Crisis. Well, one I did was Rommel and Montgomery, the Battle of El Alamein. We'd already done Rommel as a biography show. It was easy enough to find Montgomery. We put them together, put in some more battle stuff, and we had a new show. The distributor of Biography didn't take to this at all. He sued, and I forget how it all came out. But we went ahead and did the rest of at least one season of the series.
What network was it on?
It was, again, syndicated. It was UAA.
And do you remember who sponsored it?
Again, it would have been market by market.
And who was in charge of the series?
That was Alan Lansberg.
And talk about what it was like to work with him.
He was great. He's I think Jack wouldn't mind if you said he was a good bit more efficient than Jack. And he's very, very quick and understanding. He was a seasoned writer, so he knew what it took. He was tremendous.
So, did you do 26 of those?
We did a season, yeah, probably was 26.
Let's see. Now, what was there one called the wets versus the dries?
Yeah, Prohibition. I mean, we were stretching the concept as far as we could go, but by that time we'd learned go where the film is, and the film of the debate about prohibition and the prohibitionists going around and smashing liquor bottles, and the old Irish politicians trying to have it both ways, and it was just great. It's really one of the mainstays of 1930s newsreels is that stuff. So they went to town.
These were men in serious crisis.
Yeah,
They needed it.
yeah, but you're right.
So who was the series narrator on this?
That was Edmund O'Brien, who was wonderful. Although towards the end of his life, and we had a lot of trouble with Eddie, but he was worth it, and we loved him. He'd had a stroke, and there were certain words and combinations of sounds that he simply didn't go through his brain right, didn't get to his tongue right. And for me, very unfortunately, one of the things he could not say was El Alamein. And, my script was the Battle of El Alamein, at El Alamein. Meanwhile, El Alamein was the main thing in the script, and we didn't find this out until we got to the recording session. And it was very humiliating for him. He's a fine actor, and, he could stand on his head and he couldn't say it. So eventually we got to doing it syllable by syllable. El, Al, Main, in the various intonations. We made a little word kit, and then we managed to cut it together so that it sounded pretty okay. Eddie was just, this is where you can run on and on, that he would come in, he would do the script, we'd go across the street for lunch, and he'd order 3 double vodka martinis straight up for openers. And then he'd just start telling you about Hollywood in the 20s.
Okay, I guess we're going to take a break. Wow. So